There is a mirror in every judgment you have ever made about another person. Not a flattering mirror, not the kind you choose to look into, the kind that appears without invitation in the middle of an ordinary conversation or an ordinary observation about someone else's behavior, and shows you, if you're willing to look directly at it, something about yourself that you've been working very hard not to see. Gabor Maté spent 50 years pointing at that mirror, not to shame the people who looked away from it, not to suggest that the judgment was wrong in any simple moral sense, or that the person being judged deserved no honest assessment of their behavior, but to illuminate something that most psychological framers acknowledge in theory, and very few people apply honestly to themselves. That the qualities we judge most harshly in others, the ones that produce not just ordinary disapproval, but something more heated, more personal, more viscerally reactive than the situation seems to warrant, those qualities are almost never random. They are almost always qualities that live in us. Qualities that we developed in a specific emotional environment of our early life, and then, for reasons that made complete sense at the time, decided were unacceptable. Dangerous, too much, not permitted. Qualities that we then sealed off, suppressed, drove underground into the specific psychological territory that Carl Jung called the shadow, the repository of everything the self decided could not be integrated into the conscious identity. Everything that had to be hidden, from others first, and then, with sufficient practice, from ourselves. And those qualities, the ones we sealed off, the ones we decided were not us, the ones we have spent years or decades believing we do not possess, did not disappear. They went underground. And from underground, they generate something. They generate judgment. The specific, heated, disproportionate, strangely personal quality of judgment that arise when we encounter in another person the very thing we have most thoroughly convinced ourselves we are not. The anger that rises when we see someone being selfish, when we have spent our entire adult life in compulsive self-sacrifice. The contempt we feel for someone's neediness, when our own needs have been sealed behind a wall of self-sufficiency so complete that we have almost forgotten they exist. The irritation we experience at someone else's anger, when our own anger has been suppressed so long and so completely that its presence in another person feels like a threat to the suppression we have worked so hard to maintain. Gabor Maté says, "Show me what a person judges most harshly in others, and I will show you what they're most afraid of finding in themselves." This is not a comfortable thing to sit with. It was not meant to be. It is meant to be the beginning of the most honest and the most important self-inquiry available. The inquiry that starts not with what is wrong with them, but with what is unresolved in me. Not with what they need to change, but with what I have been unwilling to see. That inquiry is what today is about. If something in you already responded to what I just described, if a specific judgment arose in your mind, and something in your body recognized the mirror I am pointing at, I want you to drop 777 in the comments right now. 777. The frequency of the pattern finally being seen by the one who has been running it. When you type 777, you are saying, I am willing to look at what my judgments are actually showing me about myself. Type 777 and let us look together. Let me begin where Gabor Maté always began, with the origin. Because the shadow, the repository of the qualities we have judged as unacceptable in ourselves, does not form randomly. It is built, deliberately, intelligently, at real personal cost, by a young nervous system responding to a specific emotional environment that communicated, in ways both explicit and implicit, which aspects of the self were welcome and which were not. The child whose anger was met with fear or punishment learned that anger was dangerous, not just in others, in themselves. And the most efficient way to manage a quality that is dangerous is to deny its existence, to build an identity organized around its absence, to become the person who is not angry, who is calm and reasonable and measured, who has transcended the primitive reactivity of anger to the achievement of maturity and equanimity. And then to feel, when encountering anger in others, a specific quality of reactive judgment that has nothing to do with a considered ethical position about anger's appropriate role in human life, and everything to do with the specific threat that another person's visible anger poses to the carefully maintained fiction that anger is simply not present in the self. The child whose neediness was met with withdrawal or dismissal learned that needing was weak, that the appropriate response to one's own needs was to manage them, suppress them, become so self-sufficient that the question of needing never arose. And then to feel, when encountering someone else's open expression of need, a contempt so automatic and so complete that it arises before any conscious evaluation. The contempt of the self that sealed its own needs behind self-sufficiency, reacting to the sight of needs that were not sealed. The child whose authentic self-expression was met with disapproval or redirection learned that being too much was dangerous, that the size of the authentic self needed to be reduced to something more acceptable, more manageable, more comfortable for the people on whom survival depended. And then to feel, when encountering someone who takes up full space, who's unabashedly themselves, who does not modulate their self-expression in response to the perceived discomfort of others, a judgment so immediate and so personal that it cannot possibly be about the other person alone. Gabor Maté says, "We do not judge the qualities we have genuinely transcended. We judge the qualities we have buried. Because transcendence produces understanding, burial produces reactivity. And the reactivity, the specific, heated, visceral quality of the judgment, is the shadow speaking. The sealed-off quality recognizing itself in the other person and generating the alarm response of something that should not be visible being made visible. Now I want to give you the 7 specific ways that shadow judgment operates, the 7 faces of the mirror that appears in our harshest assessments of others, not as a shaming exercise, as a map, so that you can finally read the judgment as information about yourself rather than simply experiencing it as information about the person you are judging. The first face. You judge in others the emotions you were not permitted to feel. This is the most fundamental phase, and it appears with the most consistency across the widest range of individual histories and individual judgments. The specific emotion that was sealed in the earliest relational environment, the one whose presence in the self was met with the most consistent disapproval or the most threatening consequence, that emotion produces the most reactive judgment when it appears visibly in others. The person who was not permitted anger judges angry people with a specific moral fervor that goes beyond reasonable objection to harmful behavior. The person who was not permitted sadness judges sad people as self-pitying or manipulative. The person who was not permitted fear judges fearful people as weak or cowardly. The person who was not permitted joy, whose early environment communicated that happiness was frivolous or dangerous or a form of hubris, judges joyful people as shallow or naive. Gabor Maté asks, which emotion most consistently produces judgment when you encounter it in others? And then he asks the question that matters. When did you last allow yourself to fully feel that emotion? Not manage it, not rooted through productivity or spiritual bypassing or the conversion of the feeling into something more acceptable. When did you last actually feel it? The judgment is pointing directly at the answer. The second phase. You judge in others the needs you were taught to suppress in yourself. Need is perhaps the quality most universally sealed in the shadow of the adult self that learned conditional love. Because conditional love, love that was available when the self was performing correctly, and withdrawn when the self was expressing genuine need, teaches a specific lesson about the danger of needing with extraordinary efficiency. The lesson that need is weakness, that need is burden, that need makes you too much for the people around you, that the appropriate management of need is its suppression. And the person who has suppressed their own needs with sufficient thoroughness will judge the needs of others with the specific quality of someone who has paid an enormous price for something they are watching someone else display for free. The contempt for neediness is almost always the self-contempt of the person who needed and learned that needing was not safe, projected outward onto the person who is still doing what the judgment decided was no longer permitted. Gabor Maté says, the judgment of someone else's need is almost always a communication about your own, about the specific way that your own needs were received or not received in the original relational environment, about what you learned was permissible to want and what needed to be hidden, and about the specific cost you have paid year after year for the suppression of needs that were as legitimate and as real as the ones you are currently judging. The third phase. You judge in others the authenticity you were required to perform away. The person who was required to be other than who they genuinely were, who learned to modulate and manage and present a more acceptable version of themselves in response to the specific requirements of their early environment. That person will often judge authentic self-expression in others with a quality that is not simply aesthetic preference or reasonable social observation. It will be personal. It will carry a heat that comes from somewhere older than the current encounter. It will generate descriptions like too much, embarrassing, attention-seeking, inappropriate, too loud, too emotional, too open, too confident, too willing to take up space. Descriptions that track exactly the dimensions of authentic expression that the person offering the judgment was required to reduce in themselves. Gabor Maté understood this as one of the most common and one of the most costly expressions of shadow judgment available. Because the judgment of authentic self-expression in others does not only reveal the seal, it maintains it. Every time we judge the quality in someone else, we reinforce the internal prohibition against that quality in ourselves. We double down on the suppression. We use the external judgment as additional evidence for the internal verdict. That quality is not acceptable, not in them, not in me, never in me. The fourth phase. You judge in others the ambition or desire you were taught to deny. This phase of the shadow is less commonly discussed than the others, and it is among the most important. Because in many family systems and cultural contexts, the qualities of ambition, desire, wanting more, pursuing what genuinely calls to the self, these qualities were communicated as dangerous, as selfish, as evidence of insufficient gratitude for what was already present, as the kind of reaching that good people, humble people, appropriately modest people do not engage in. And the person who internalized that message, who sealed their own genuine desire and genuine ambition behind the performance of contentment, will often judge ambitious people or visibly desiring people with a specific quality of moral disapproval. They will describe the person as greedy, as never satisfied, as lacking gratitude, as having inappropriate priorities. And beneath all of those descriptions will be the sealed desire. The wanting that was taught was not permitted. The ambition that was communicated as selfish. The reaching for something more than what was given that the early environment made dangerous. Looking at itself in the mirror of someone else's visible desire and judging what it sees because it cannot acknowledge what it is. The fifth phase. You judge in others the vulnerability you sealed behind self-sufficiency. The person will learn that vulnerability was not safe, that opening fully, that allowing genuine exposure, that being seen in the full reality of their uncertainty or their fear or their genuine emotional experience carried costs that were not worth paying. That person built a specific kind of fortress, self-sufficiency, competence, the presentation of a self that does not need, does not fear, does not doubt, does not open to the risk of genuine exposure. And from inside that fortress, the visibility of vulnerability in others produces a judgment that is part contempt and part something more complicated, something that has the quality of looking at someone doing what was decided was too dangerous, and feeling a mixture of genuine disdain and something that is not quite disdain, but is somewhere between envy and grief. The grief of the self that sealed its own vulnerability, looking at a self that did not. Gabor Maté says, the contempt for vulnerability is almost always the self-protection of someone whose vulnerability was not safe. Not evidence of strength, evidence of a specific quality of wound that made strength necessary as its primary response. The sixth phase, you judge in others the pleasure or joy you decided you did not deserve. This face to the shadow is perhaps the most poignant. The person who learned through the specific emotional climate of their early environment, through the models of adult life they witnessed, through the implicit and explicit messages about what was appropriate and what was indulgent, that genuine pleasure, genuine rest, genuine enjoyment of life, without the prerequisite of sufficient suffering or sufficient productivity, was not something available to them. That joy was something to be earned, that ease was something to be suspicious of, that the appropriate relationship to one's own experience was one of constant vigilance and constant effort rather than genuine inhabitation and genuine pleasure. That person will judge people who display genuine ease or genuine pleasure with a specific moral quality. They will describe them as irresponsible, as shallow, as not taking life seriously enough, as having it too easy. And what the judgment is actually saying, what the shadow is actually expressing through the moral disapproval, is the specific grief of a self that was taught to be suspicious of its own joy, that learned that pleasure needed to be justified, that internalized the prohibition against ease so completely that the sight of someone else inhabiting it without apparent guilt produces a reactive judgment rather than a genuine ethical assessment. The seventh phase, and this is the one that Gabor Maté returned to as the most important and the most personally illuminating phase of shadow judgment. You judge most harshly in others the qualities that your wound required you to become. This is the most subtle and the most significant phase, the one that requires the most honest looking to see, because it involves not the qualities that were sealed, the ones we definitely do not have and definitely do not want, but the qualities that were built, the adaptive strategies, the specific personality characteristics that the wound produced in us as its most intelligent available response to the original relational environment. The person who became compulsively self-sufficient will often judge self-sufficiency in others as coldness or unavailability. The person who became a compulsive caregiver will often judge caregiving in others as enabling or as boundary violation. The person who became conflict avoidant will often judge conflict avoidance in others as passive aggression. The person who became hyperachieving will often judge achievement in others as compensatory or as lacking genuine depth. We judge the strategy in others because we carry beneath the strategy we ourselves built the ambivalence about it. The part of us that knows the self-sufficiency is also loneliness, that the caregiving is also self-abandonment, that the conflict avoidance is also suppression, that the achievement is also the wound's attempt to prove what the wound said was unproven. And seeing that ambivalence clearly in someone else where it is safer to look at it first is often the beginning of being able to see it in ourselves. Now I want to speak to what is actually available in the moment the mirror appears. Because the mirror is not only a revelation of what has been sealed, it is an invitation, an opportunity that arrives in the guise of an ordinary negative judgment about someone else's ordinary behavior. An opportunity that, when it is taken, when the judgment is turned inward with genuine curiosity rather than simply directed outward with confident certainty, produces something that no other root produces in quite the same form. It produces contact with the shadow. Not comfortable contact, not the contact of someone who is prepared for what they will find there, but genuine contact, the specific, somewhat disorienting, genuinely important experience of encountering the part of yourself that the self-concept insisted was not there. Gabor Maté says, the qualities we find in the shadow are not our worst qualities, they're our most human ones. The anger that was sealed is not pathological rage. It is the legitimate response of a self that has genuine limits and genuine experiences of having those limits violated. The need that was sealed is not pathological dependency. It is the genuine requirement of a human being for connection, for care, for the authentic give and take of genuine relationship. The desire that was sealed is not greed. It is the soul's knowledge of what it actually came here to experience and contribute. These sealed qualities, when they are finally encountered with genuine compassion, rather than with the judgment that has been redirecting them outward, are not the problem. They are the resolution. They are the parts of the self that the wound declared dangerous and that genuine healing declares necessary. Necessary for wholeness, for genuine self-knowledge, for the specific quality of being in the world that becomes available when the self is no longer divided against itself. The judgment pointed at the sealed quality, the honest turning toward it, is the beginning of the integration. The beginning of the shadow becoming not the source of reactive projection onto others, but the foundation of genuine self-understanding. And the person who has done that work, who has used their judgments as the maps they actually are, who has followed each heated assessment of another person's quality back to the specific, sealed version of that quality in themselves, who has encountered what was sealed with genuine compassion rather than with the judgment that sent it underground in the first place, that person does not stop having assessments of other people's behavior. They are not required to pretend that everything everyone does is equally valid or equally wise or equally worth engaging with. But the heat goes out of the judgment. The personal quality dissolves. The specific reactive charge that came from the sealed quality being triggered by its mirror in the other person diminishes as the sealed quality is no longer sealed, as it is integrated, as the self becomes large enough to contain what it previously had to seal off in order to maintain its identity. And that larger self, the one that has integrated the shadow rather than projected it, has something available that the judging self did not. Genuine compassion for others. Not performed compassion, not the compassion that is really just careful management of the anxiety that genuine contact with another person's difficult qualities produces, but genuine compassion, the specific quality of understanding that arrives when you have met your own anger, your own need, your own vulnerability, your own desire, your own ambivalence, and found them not shameful, but human. Genuinely, recognizably, completely human. From that recognition, the other person's anger or need or vulnerability or desire or ambivalence is no longer a mirror that threatens to reveal what was sealed. It is simply the same humanity, in a different body, with a different history, expressed in a different form. And meeting it there, from the genuinely integrated self rather than from the defended one, is one of the most healing things one human being can offer another. That is what the judgment was always pointing toward, not the conclusion that the other person was wrong. The invitation to finally meet yourself, all the way, with everything that was sealed. And the privilege of a lifetime, the one that Gabor Maté pointed toward with everything he had in every book and every lecture and every hour of sitting with human beings at the full, honest depth of their most unguarded experience. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not the version of yourself that required the shadow to carry what the identity could not hold. Not the self that maintained its coherence to the projection of its sealed qualities onto the people around it, but who you truly are, with the anger and the need and the vulnerability and the desire and the ambition and the joy and the full, complex human range of what was sealed, integrated, present, genuinely yours. The mirror in the judgment has always been showing you the way home. It is time to look into it fully and to recognize in what looks back yourself.